The first thing Amelia Carter did, as Lorenzo Duca's bride, was nearly strangle him. Not intentionally. That distinction mattered, especially when the man whose tie she had wrapped around her fist happened to be one of the most feared mafia bosses in Chicago. 1 second, Amelia was walking across the marble foyer of the Duca estate, trying very hard to look like a woman who belonged there. The next, her heel caught the edge of an expensive rug, her suitcase rolled away, her body pitched forward, and the nearest thing her hand found was Lorenzo Duca's black tie. She grabbed it hard. Lorenzo jerked forward. Amelia slammed into his chest, one palm pressed against his white shirt, the other still clutching his tie like she had crossed 3 states for the sole purpose of assassinating him with Italian silk. The foyer went completely silent. 2 elegant women, standing near the entrance, stopped whispering. One of Lorenzo's guards looked away immediately, not because he was afraid, because the idiot was trying not to laugh. Amelia slowly lifted her eyes, and that was when she finally got a proper look at the man she had come to marry. Lorenzo Duca was big, not simply tall, not simply broad. Big in the way that made the enormous mansion around him somehow look slightly less enormous. His black suit stretched across wide shoulders. His dark hair was neatly swept back. His jaw was shadowed with a trimmed beard, and his eyes, those cold, dark eyes, were staring directly at the fist still wrapped around his tie. Amelia followed his gaze. Her face changed. She released him immediately. "Oh, that was all she managed. Oh." Lorenzo said nothing. Amelia tried taking one dignified step backward. Unfortunately, dignity had apparently missed the flight. Her heel slipped again. Lorenzo caught her around the waist before she could hit the floor, and suddenly Amelia Carter was pressed against the very man women had spent years whispering about. This time, the silence felt different. Lorenzo felt it too. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did, because he knew what usually came next. The stare, the uncertainty, that tiny shift in a woman's face when curiosity became something else. He had seen it before, enough times, more than enough. There was a reason Lorenzo Duca was standing at 38 years old, with an empire, a mansion, enough money to buy half the street outside, and an Ennio wife. There was a reason certain women lowered their voices when his name came up. A reason conversations became unusually interesting whenever someone mentioned his size. And there was definitely a reason Lorenzo had promised himself he was finished with brides. Yet there he stood, holding another one. Bride number 7. Amelia Carter. Plus size, beautiful, flushed from embarrassment, and currently staring up at him with her mouth slightly open. Lorenzo waited for the fear, for the awkwardness, for something. Instead, Amelia looked down at the arm around her waist, then back at him. "Do I get 3 falls before you send me home? Or was that the limit?" Marco made a choking sound behind them. Lorenzo's eyes moved toward him. Marco immediately became fascinated with the ceiling. Amelia's face reened. "Sorry, nervous joke." Lorenzo looked back at her. "You're nervous?" Amelia glanced around at the marble floors, the armed men, at the chandelier probably worth more than her childhood home. Then finally, at the enormous MafiaBoss still holding her upright. A little. Lorenzo released her carefully. Amelia straightened her burgundy dress, then picked up what remained of her dignity, or tried to. Her suitcase had rolled several feet away, and was now resting beside one of the women near the entrance. The blonde woman looked down at it, then at Amelia, then at Lorenzo. There was amusement in her expression, but there was something else too. Something Amelia recognized immediately. judgment. The second woman leaned closer and whispered something. Amelia couldn't hear the words. She didn't have to. She knew that look. She had seen variations of it in restaurants, at weddings, in clothing stores, and beside men who thought a plus-size woman should be grateful for attention. But this time, they weren't only looking at her. They were looking at Lorenzo, too. And that interested Amelia because somewhere between accepting this ridiculous arrangement and arriving at his mansion, she had learned there were two versions of Lorenzo Duca. The one men talked about, and the one women whispered about. The first was dangerous, powerful, cold. A man whose enemies had a habit of disappearing from important conversations. The second version was discussed much more quietly, usually after a glass of wine, sometimes followed by laughter, and always involving one word: sighs. Amelia hadn't asked questions, not because she wasn't curious. She was human, but she'd learned something years ago about cruel gossip. The person telling it usually revealed far more about themselves than the person they were discussing. So she'd come against common sense, against the warning from a woman who had called her 3 days earlier, against the little voice in her own head, asking why a man like Lorenzo Duca needed a stranger to agree to become his bride in the first place. And now, standing barely 3 away from him, Amelia understood one thing. Whatever had happened before her, Lorenzo expected it to happen again. She could see it. Not fear, not desperation, expectation. The quiet certainty of a man already waiting for someone to leave. And for some reason, that bothered her more than the rumors. Lorenzo adjusted the tie she'd nearly used to end the Duca bloodline. Your journey was comfortable. There it was. Cold, formal, controlled, as though 60 seconds earlier she hadn't been hanging from his neck. Amelia nodded. Mostly. Lorenzo glanced toward her suitcase. Mostly, the driver brakes aggressively. From behind, Lorenzo came Marco's calm voice. You asked him to stop twice because you thought you saw a bakery. Amelia turned slowly. Marco's face remained perfectly straight. She narrowed her eyes. One of them was a bakery. Lorenzo looked at Marco. Marco looked at Lorenzo. Then something almost impossible happened. The corner of Lorenzo Duca's mouth moved barely, but Amelia saw it. She pointed at him before thinking better of it. You smiled. The expression vanished. No, you did. I didn't. Amelia looked at Marco for confirmation. Marco, apparently valuing his continued employment, stared straight ahead. Coward, Amelia muttered. This time, Lorenzo actually had to look away, and the two women near the entrance noticed. So did Marco. So did Amelia. But perhaps Lorenzo noticed most of all, because it had been a very long time since a woman had stood this close to him, knowing exactly who he was, and worried more about embarrassing herself than escaping him. That should have made him curious. Instead, it made him cautious. Hope was an expensive mistake. Lorenzo Duca had already paid for it before. He had no intention of paying again, so he reached for Amelia's suitcase. Amelia reached at the same time. Their hands met on the handle. She froze. Lorenzo froze. For one strange beat, their eyes locked. Then Amelia removed her hand. Fine, you carry it. Lorenzo lifted the suitcase easily. Amelia watched. Her eyebrows rose. Lorenzo noticed. And just like that, the small trace of warmth disappeared from his face. There, that look again. He knew it. He hated it. Amelia saw his expression change, but didn't understand why. Not yet. She simply followed him toward the staircase, completely unaware that the two women behind her had resumed whispering. One of them watched Amelia climb the stairs, then quietly murmured, "She won't last." The other smiled. "None of them do." Amelia kept walking. Maybe she didn't hear. Maybe she did. Lorenzo didn't turn around to find out, because he had already decided how this story would end. Amelia Carter would stay long enough to become curious enough to ask questions. And eventually, she would discover whatever she believed she needed to know. Then, like every woman before her, she would leave. What Lorenzo Duca didn't know was that Amelia hadn't arrived ignorant. She had heard enough. And enough to know there was a secret. Enough to know women had rejected him because of it. Enough to know the word size followed his name like a shadow. But there was one thing nobody had managed to tell her. The thing Amelia would eventually discover for herself was why a man powerful enough to make an entire city afraid looked almost terrified whenever a woman got too close. Amelia Carter followed Lorenzo Duca up the sweeping marble staircase with considerably more caution than she had used entering his estate. That lesson had been learned. The rug downstairs had already attempted murder. She was not giving the staircase the same opportunity. Lorenzo walked several steps ahead of her, carrying her rose-gold suitcase in one hand, as though it contained feathers instead of most of Amelia's earthly possessions. She kept her eyes on the steps very carefully. The last thing Amelia needed was to tumble down a staircase less than 10 minutes after nearly strangling her future husband with his own tie. Behind them, the two elegant women from the foyer remained below. Amelia could still feel their eyes following her. Polished women, perfect posture, the kind who probably crossed marble floors in 4-in-heels without once requiring assistance from the nearest Mafia boss. Amelia possessed many useful talents. Balance was apparently not among them. When Lorenzo reached the upper landing, he glanced back. Amelia immediately loosened the death grip she had on the railing. His eyebrow lifted. That irritating, almost smile appeared again. She pretended not to notice. So did he. The corridor beyond was enormous, lined with dark paintings, tall windows, and expensive furniture that looked as though nobody had actually sat on it in years. The entire estate was immaculate. Too immaculate. No coat draped across a chair. No book left open. No coffee cup forgotten somewhere. No family photographs scattered casually around. Everything was prepared for life, yet strangely absent of it. Amelia noticed, and judging by the brief look Lorenzo gave her, so did he. At the end of the corridor, he opened a pair of doors. The bedroom beyond made Amelia stop. Calling it a bedroom felt insulting. There was a sitting area, fireplace, dressing room, enormous windows overlooking the estate grounds, and a bathroom large enough to require its own postal code. Lorenzo placed her suitcase near the wardrobe. Then he did something Amelia hadn't expected. He stepped back toward the doorway. He didn't casually wander farther into the room, didn't inspect her belongings, didn't behave like the estate gave him ownership of everything inside it. Instead, he remained at the threshold and placed a small brass key into her palm. There was only one, hers. The rules were simple. The staff would knock, Marco would knock, Lorenzo would knock. If Amelia locked that door, nobody entered, not even him. For several seconds, Amelia forgot about the enormous room. Her attention stayed on the key. There had been another man once, Ethan Cole, a man who had slowly turned access into entitlement. At first, possessing a key to her apartment had seemed romantic. Later, it became normal for him to enter without warning, check what she bought, look through messages, question where she had gone, ask why certain doors were closed. Privacy became secrecy. Secrecy became guilt. And guilt became something Amelia was expected to prove she didn't have. Now the man half of Chicago supposedly feared was giving Amelia the ability to lock him out. That irony wasn't lost on her. She thanked Lorenzo quietly. He studied her for a moment, clearly aware that her reaction was larger than the gesture deserved. But he didn't ask. He simply left. Amelia remained alone, the key resting against her palm. Maybe Lorenzo considered it nothing. To Amelia, it wasn't nothing at all. She unpacked slowly. 1 suitcase. 90 days. That was the arrangement. Not a wedding. Not yet. 3 months to decide that 2 complete strangers could actually tolerate each other long enough to consider marriage. It was absurd, old-fashioned, and very much the sort of plan only an extremely wealthy grandmother could arrange without feeling embarrassed. Amelia had almost thrown away the original letter. The matrimonial service sounded like something invented 2 centuries too late. Then attorneys had contacted her. Background documents followed. And finally, Rosa Duca herself. Nonna Rosa had explained that her grandson needed a wife with common sense, patience, and enough backbone to survive the Duca family. Amelia had wondered aloud what exactly was wrong with Lorenzo. The old woman had blamed mostly his personality. Amelia laughed. Apparently, that was the moment Nonna decided she liked her. Only later did Amelia discover exactly W.H. Lorenzo Duca was. By then, curiosity had taken hold. The agreement made it worse. No penalty if she left, no obligation, no financial dependence, her own room, her own choices. For a supposedly controlling mafia boss, Lorenzo's arrangement seemed designed to give the woman every possible escape route. That contradiction fascinated Amelia. The rumors fascinated her even more. Some involved his business, some involved violence, and others were decidedly more personal. But rumors alone weren't enough to stop her. Amelia knew better than most what happened when strangers began deciding the truth about someone's body. So she had packed, boarded the plane, arrived at the estate, then tried to assassinate the groom with Italian silk. An excellent beginning. Dinner brought Amelia face to face with the true ruler of the Duca estate. And it wasn't Lorenzo. Rosa Duca was 79, barely over 5 feet tall, dressed elegantly in black, and completely unimpressed by the fact that her grandson could terrify grown men by entering a room. Lorenzo sat beside Amelia. Marco remained nearby with the same expression he seemed to wear everywhere. Amelia had started wondering whether Marco actually slept or simply stood in a dark corner until morning and resumed operations. Nonna wasted little time mentioning Amelia's entrance. Apparently, Marco had already reported the tie incident. Traitor Rosa found it highly entertaining. Lorenzo did not. The old woman calmly observed that if Amelia had truly intended to kill her grandson, she would need something considerably stronger than a necktie. Amelia nearly laughed into her napkin. Lorenzo looked as though he was reconsidering having a family. For several minutes, dinner became unexpectedly easy. Then Nonna asked whether Amelia had heard the stories. The mood changed immediately. Lorenzo became still. Amelia knew exactly which stories mattered. She acknowledged that she had heard enough. Enough to know that wealthy people apparently had even more time for gossip than ordinary people. Lorenzo's expression tightened. Before the moment could become heavier, Amelia's elbow caught the spoon beside her plate. It dropped. She tried stopping it with her shoe. That resulted in the spoon shooting underneath Lorenzo's chair. Silence. Amelia stared down. Perfect. Nothing restored dignity after a conversation about intimate rumors quite like kicking silverware beneath your future husband's legs. Marco turned his head. One shoulder moved. The man was laughing. Amelia knew it. Lorenzo retrieved the spoon and placed it calmly beside her plate. Nona watched the two of them and smiled. That smile worried Amelia. The old woman looked like someone whose plans were progressing exactly as intended. Later that evening, Lorenzo found Amelia standing near the tall windows overlooking the gardens. He wasted no time. She could leave tonight. A car would take her wherever she wanted, and nothing promised in the agreement would be taken away. The offer wasn't threatening. It was almost too generous, which made Amelia study him more carefully. Lorenzo wasn't testing her. He genuinely expected her to leave. The rumors had convinced him that remaining required courage. Amelia disagreed. She didn't know Lorenzo well enough to decide whether he deserved fear or affection, or anything in between. That was the point of being there. If she eventually left, she intended to leave because of something Lorenzo actually died, not because strangers whispered and expected her to borrow their judgment. For once, Lorenzo had nothing to say. Amelia left him standing there, then took the wrong corridor. 3 steps later, she returned. Lorenzo silently pointed toward the correct hallway. Amelia pretended she had merely been checking something. He pretended to believe her, and after she finally disappeared, Lorenzo Duca laughed quietly to himself. Unfortunately, Amelia's directional abilities did not improve after midnight. She went downstairs looking for water and somehow ended up in a part of the estate she had never seen. Long corridors looked identical in darkness. Eventually, she opened what she thought was the library. It wasn't, at least not the public one. This room belonged to Lorenzo. She knew immediately. His desk dominated one side. Books filled dark shelves. Photographs showed a younger Lorenzo beside Nona, Marco, and several stern-looking men Amelia suspected had never spent a peaceful afternoon feeding ducks. She should have left. She intended to. Then she noticed a drawer sitting slightly open. Inside, velvet. Curiosity moved faster than common sense. Amelia approached. 6 small boxes rested inside. She opened the first. A diamond ring, then the second. Another different. The third. Another. 6 rings, 6 boxes. And suddenly, the joke stopped being funny. These weren't gossip. These were evidence of 6 moments when Lorenzo had believed something might actually work. 6 times he had apparently chosen a ring. 6 times it had returned. Amelia slowly closed one of the boxes. Then a voice came from behind her. "Lorenzo?" She turned. He stood in the doorway without his jacket. White shirt opened slightly at the throat. His eyes fixed on the ring in Amelia's hand. He wasn't angry. That would have been easier. For the first time since Amelia arrived, Lorenzo Duca looked like a man who had been caught standing beside an old wound. And Amelia suddenly wished she had never opened the drawer. Lorenzo closed the drawer himself. One quiet movement, and all 6 rings disappeared. Amelia tried explaining that she had gotten lost, which unfortunately was completely believable by now. She admitted she shouldn't have opened it. Lorenzo didn't argue. He simply told her where her room was and escorted her back. No accusation, no anger, no questions. His silence did more than anger could have. When Amelia locked her bedroom door that night, she stood for a long time, with one hand on the key, thinking about 6 velvet boxes sitting inside a dark drawer. For next several days, Lorenzo became exceptionally polite. That was how Amelia knew he was avoiding her. He still appeared at meals, still asked whether she needed transportation, still ensured everything she requested appeared almost immediately. But the small warmth that had begun between them disappeared. Lorenzo had erected a wall, and Amelia knew enough not to attack it directly, so she watched. The Duca estate operated strangely. Vehicles arrived late at night. Men entered offices and lowered their voices. Armed guards appeared where ordinary families might have placed decorative lamps. Doors occasionally closed when Amelia approached. Nobody needed to explain Lorenzo's profession. Yet, alongside the feared Mafia boss, another version of Lorenzo kept peering when nobody seemed to expect Amelia was watching. One morning, she found him repairing Nonna Rosa's bracelet. The clasp was tiny. Lorenzo's hands were not. Yet he worked patiently, handling the delicate metal with astonishing precision, while Nonna criticized everything from his breathing to his technique. The old woman inspected his finished work as though Lorenzo had applied for employment, then gave a reluctant nod of approval. Lorenzo looked offended. Amelia laughed. For a second, his wall cracked. Then came the injured guard. The man returned to the estate, barely able to walk, ribs damaged badly enough that even breathing hurt. Lorenzo could easily have ordered someone else to help. He didn't. Amelia watched him lift the man himself. Those enormous arms, those hands people whispered about, became almost impossibly careful. No sudden movement, no unnecessary pressure. Strength completely under control. Another afternoon, Marco brought his 5-year-old daughter to the estate. The little girl ran straight toward Lorenzo. Without hesitation, the towering Mafia boss crouched so she wouldn't have to crane her neck. She presented him with a drawing, a large square figure with arms, legs, and something resembling angry eyebrows. Lorenzo studied it seriously. Amelia assumed it was a horse. The child corrected her. It was Lorenzo. Marco appeared horrified. Amelia nearly fell off the sofa, laughing. Lorenzo, however, nodded solemnly, as though the resemblance was undeniable. Later that evening, Amelia noticed the drawing displayed proudly on his desk. That was when she realized she was beginning to notice far too much about Lorenzo Duca. Lorenzo was noticing her, too. Amelia didn't hide beneath shapeless clothes. She ate what she wanted, enjoyed dessert, laughed loudly, occupied space without constantly apologizing for existing, at least until strangers entered the picture. At a charity luncheon, the Duca family gathered for photographs. Without thinking, Amelia moved toward the back. Lorenzo's hand reached behind him. He found hers and pulled her forward until she stood beside him. He offered no explanation. Photograph was taken. Hours later, an older woman complimented Amelia's fitted burgundy dress, then added how brave she was for wearing something like that. There it was, a compliment sharpened just enough to cut. Amelia smiled politely. Years of experience made the response automatic, but Lorenzo saw the flicker beneath it. Moments later, his hand rested lightly at the small of her back. He guided Amelia away. No confrontation, no spectacle. He simply removed her from the woman's reach. Unfortunately, Lorenzo marched with such confidence that he accidentally led them directly beside a coat closet instead of back toward the ballroom. Amelia discovered that the mighty Lorenzo Duca could apparently intimidate an entire room while being completely lost inside his own hotel. The realization delighted her. Lorenzo saw the amusement coming and warned her with one look. Amelia said nothing. She didn't need to. Her face did enough. And despite himself, Lorenzo smiled. 3 mornings later came another small disaster. Amelia reached across the breakfast table for strawberry jam. Her sleeve caught a water glass. It tipped. Lorenzo caught it without looking away from his newspaper. Amelia froze. Nona didn't. Marco didn't. Apparently, this had happened before, more than once. Amelia discovered that Lorenzo had quietly saved 8 objects from destruction since her arrival. The 8th had been a pepper grinder. Amelia didn't even remember dropping. That was perhaps the most insulting part. Lorenzo had become so efficient at rescuing things around her. She wasn't always aware there had been a crisis. None found Amelia's outrage hysterical. Marco tried unsuccessfully to remain professional. Even Lorenzo looked pleased with himself. For a few minutes, the breakfast room felt almost ordinary, warm, easy. Then Nono mentioned marriage. The atmosphere changed. Lorenzo's amusement vanished. Amelia noticed marriage wasn't merely a future possibility inside this house. It was a graveyard. Nobody stepped near without remembering what had already been buried there. That evening, Bianca Romano arrived. Amelia recognized her face before she knew her name. One of the women from the foyer. Beautiful, polished, and far too familiar with Lorenzo. Bianca's gaze moved over Amelia slowly, taking in her dress, her figure. Then Lorenzo. There was something knowing in the woman's expression, something Amelia disliked immediately. Dinner remained civil. Technically, Bianca didn't insult Amelia openly. Women like Bianca rarely needed to. Every question carried an extra edge. Was Amelia adjusting to the estate? Was Lorenzo's lifestyle overwhelming? Had she found him difficult? That tiny hesitation before certain words told Amelia everything. Later, near dessert, Amelia heard Bianca's companion whisper that she should simply wait until Amelia found out. Then came soft laughter. Amelia considered reacting. Instead, she took one cannoli, then another, and ate both with direct eye contact. Across the room, Lorenzo saw everything. So did Bianca. That mattered more. When Amelia returned to Lorenzo's side, he glanced at the 2 desserts, then at her. There was amusement in his eyes, but when his gaze moved toward Bianca, the amusement died. What replaced it wasn't affection, not even anger. It looked like something older, something damaged. Amelia remembered the rings, and suddenly she knew one of those boxes had probably once belonged to Bianca Romano. Confirmation came later. Not deliberately. Amelia had returned downstairs for a forgotten book when voices drifted from Lorenzo's office. Marco and Lorenzo. She should have continued walking. Instead, one sentence stopped her. Marco believed Amelia was different. Lorenzo didn't. His answer carried the weary certainty of someone who had seen hope become humiliation too many times. To him, women always seemed different in the beginning. Eventually, they left. Then came the words that sent Amelia's curiosity into overdrive. When she learned the truth, Lorenzo was certain she would leave too. Amelia stood motionless in the dark hallway. She already knew about the rumors, knew about the rings. She suspected Bianca had been one of the women. So, what exactly did Lorenzo believe remained hidden? And why did the most feared mafia boss in Chicago sound almost resigned to losing Amelia over something she hadn't even discovered yet? Amelia didn't confront him. Instead, she stayed. That became its own kind of challenge. Days turned into weeks. Without either of them intentionally creating it, routine formed. Every morning, strawberry pastries appeared beside Amelia's coffee. At first, she thought nothing of it. Then she noticed Lorenzo never touched them. So Amelia changed tactics. One morning, she deliberately chose chocolate. The next day, there were suddenly twice as many chocolate pastries. Lorenzo sat behind his newspaper, pretending innocence. Nona Roa noticed. Of course she did. That woman could probably detect romance from another continent. Amelia returned to Strawberry the following morning, just to test him. Lorenzo's newspaper lowered half an inch. Caught. Neither acknowledged it. Non looked ready to scream. The old woman had already begun discussing wedding flowers, despite Lorenzo repeatedly insisting there might be no wedding. Rosa wasn't concerned. If Amelia left, she announced the flowers could simply be reused at Lorenzo's funeral, because his personality would become intolerable again. Amelia nearly choked on coffee. Marco suddenly found something interesting across the room. Lorenzo looked as though he deeply regretted being born into the Duca family. The laughter that followed filled the breakfast room, and Lorenzo became strangely quiet because the Duca estate had not sounded like that in years. Amelia's presence was spreading everywhere. Her books appeared beside chairs. A pair of shoes ended up beneath a table. Flowers appeared in unused rooms. Nona stayed downstairs longer. Marco lingered occasionally instead of disappearing after business. There were cups, laughter, small traces of someone actually living there. Lorenzo's silent estate was becoming a home, and that terrified him more than Amelia understood. Because once a man became accustomed to warmth, losing it could become unbearable. Amelia began recognizing another pattern, too. Every time they grew physically close, Lorenzo retreated. A casual touch on his arm made him careful. Their fingers brushing across a table made his shoulders tighten. If Amelia sat too close, he suddenly became interested in something across the room. At first, an old insecurity whispered that perhaps Lorenzo simply wasn't attracted to her. Then she started noticing his eyes, the way they followed her when he thought she wasn't watching. The moment she entered dinner one evening, wearing a fitted navy dress, Lorenzo completely lost track of whatever Marco was explaining, only for a second. But Amelia saw it. Marco saw it. And Non Roa probably wrote the date down for future reference. Attract wasn't the problem. Something else was. Lorenzo wasn't frightened. Oh, Vermilia. He seemed frightened of what might happen if he allowed himself to want her. And that made the unanswered mystery surrounding him even more intriguing. 2 weeks later, Lorenzo needed to inspect one of the Duca family's legitimate construction projects near the river. Amelia went with him. He insisted it would be boring. Amelia had begun learning that Lorenzo, describing something as boring, usually meant he would rather she remained safely somewhere else. She wore practical shoes and privately considered making a formal announcement that she had not fallen once that morning. Marco looked at the time. It wasn't even 11. Amelia decided his silent judgment was unnecessary. Then everything changed. A violent metallic crack tore through the site. Workers shouted. Part of a temporary support structure shifted. Steel and timber crashed down. Dust exploded into the air for several seconds. Confusion swallowed the entire site. Then someone screamed. A worker was trapped beneath a heavy beam. Men rushed toward him. One tried lifting it, then two, then three. Nothing. Lorenzo was already moving. His jacket hit the ground, then his watch. He rolled his sleeves back once and stepped toward the collapsed structure. Amelia had never seen this version of him. Not the tailored Mafia boss. Not the emotionally guarded man at breakfast. Not the reluctant, almost fiancé, constantly waiting for rejection. Just Lorenzo, a very large man seeing someone trapped and knowing he possessed the strength to help. He positioned himself beneath the beam. His shoulders locked, muscle tightened beneath his white shirt. The beam shifted barely. Then again, higher. Enough. The injured worker was dragged free. Lorenzo kept holding the weight until everyone cleared the danger zone. Only then did he release it. The beam crashed down. Dust rolled around him. Amelia stood completely still. For weeks, she had heard people obsess over Lorenzo's body. His height, his breadth, his hands, his strength. That ridiculous whispered word, size. But standing there, Amelia saw something none of those people seemed interested in discussing. What that size could do. Not what it could frighten. Not what it could overwhelm. What it could overwhelm, save. Then came a child's crying. The injured worker's little daughter was nearby, terrified, trying to reach her father. Lorenzo turned toward her, and the enormous man, who had just moved something. 3 workers couldn't lift, lowered himself slowly to one knee. He didn't grab the child, didn't overwhelm her. He simply held out one hand and waited. Eventually, the little girl's fingers wrapped around one of his. Her crying eased. Amelia watched the contrast. The huge hand, the tiny fingers, the frightening man becoming someone a child trusted within seconds. Something shifted inside her. Everyone kept staring at Lorenzo Duca and imagining what those hands could retino Duca. Destroy. Amelia had spent weeks discovering what they protected. A broken bracelet, an injured guard, a little girl, falling glasses, and more times than she cared to admit her. Sighs. Maybe the world had been asking the wrong question about Lorenzo Duca all along. Then Lorenzo looked up. Their eyes met. Amelia didn't realize how intensely she'd been staring, but Lorenzo saw it, and he misunderstood everything. The softness disappeared from his expression. He stood, turned away, and by the time they returned to the estate, the wall was back. Dinner passed quietly. Later, Amelia found him alone in the kitchen. She was tired of watching him retreat every time she looked at him for too long. She intended to confront him calmly. Unfortunately, her elbow missed the kitchen island completely. 1 second, Amelia was attempting to lean casually against the counter. The next, there was nothing beneath her. Lorenzo crossed the distance before she could fall. His arms caught her again. Amelia ended up pressed against his chest again. For one humiliating second, she closed her eyes and considered simply remaining there forever, rather than acknowledging what had happened. Then she heard it, a laugh. Low, rough, unexpected. Amelia opened her eyes. Lorenzo Duca was laughing. Not smiling, not smirking, actually laughing. The sound seemed strange inside that controlled, silent kitchen, almost as though Lorenzo himself hadn't heard it often. Amelia's embarrassment disappeared. Then Marco appeared in the doorway. He stopped, saw Lorenzo laughing, saw Amelia in his arms, and quietly backed away. Smart man. The moment only became more absurd. Lorenzo laughed harder. Amelia joined him, and then both of them realized he was still holding her. The humor faded. His hands rested around her waist. Her palms were against his chest, exactly like the afternoon she arrived. But there was one important difference. This time, Amelia hadn't stumbled into the closeness, and neither of them wanted to move. Lorenzo's gaze dropped briefly toward her mouth. Amelia's breath slowed. He leaned closer and then stopped. That final distance remained untouched, and Amelia suddenly understood. He was waiting. No matter how badly Lorenzo wanted something, he would not assume it belonged to him. The realization affected her more deeply than any practiced flirtation ever could. She began lifting her face toward his. Then Nana Rosa appeared. The old woman took in the scene. Amelia in Lorenzo's arms, their faces inches apart, and immediately withdrew. Moments later, her voice echoed through the hallway, warning Marco not to enter the kitchen, because apparently progress was finally being made. Amelia wanted the marble floor to open beneath her. Lorenzo closed his eyes. Then Amelia laughed. He did too. The near kiss was ruined, and somehow became even more intimate because of it. When Lorenzo finally released her, his fingers lingered at her waist for just a moment. Amelia noticed. So did he. Neither mentioned it. The following morning, Lorenzo left the estate early. Amelia came downstairs, expecting pastries, and another breakfast filled with Non's interference. Instead, a white envelope rested beside her plate. No stamp, no return address, only her name, Amelia Carter. The air around felt wrong. She opened it. Several photographs slid across the table. Women, different women, all beside Lorenzo. Amelia's stomach tightened. One photograph showed Bianca Romano. On the back, 4 words had been written in black ink. Ask why she really left. Another photograph slipped beneath it. Another woman. Another date. Another message. You don't know him. Clear his throat. Amelia stared at the photographs. But the message wasn't what frightened her most. It was the Duca estate. Armed guards controlled the gates. Cameras watched the grounds. Staff knew every visitor. Yet, somebody had managed to put that envelope directly beside Amelia's breakfast plate, which meant someone wanted her frightened, and had gotten close enough to prove they could reach her. Inside Lorenzo Duca's own home, and suddenly the mystery surrounding his 6 failed engagements no longer felt like gossip. It felt like a warning. Amelia Carter stared at the photographs until the coffee beside her went cold. 6 women, 6 different faces, 6 different moments in Lorenzo Duca's life that somebody had carefully collected and delivered directly into the heart of his supposedly impenetrable estate. But Amelia's attention kept returning to Bianca Romano, the elegant brunette from dinner, the woman who had watched Amelia with that quiet little smile, as though she already knew how this story would end. Ask why she really left. Amelia turned the photograph over again. Same words, same black ink, no signature, nothing that revealed who had delivered it. And that bothered her, because frightening Amelia was one thing. Getting through Lorenzo's security to do it was something else. Marco entered the breakfast room less than 5 minutes later. One look at Amelia's face told him something was wrong. Then he saw the photographs. His expression changed, not dramatically. Marco Bellini was apparently incapable of dramatic facial expressions, but something sharpened behind his eyes. Within minutes, the estate changed. Guards appeared. Security footage was being reviewed. Staff were quietly questioned. Doors were checked. The easy warmth Amelia had begun associating with the mansion disappeared beneath something colder. The Duca machine had awakened, and when Lorenzo returned, it became downright frozen. He entered the breakfast room, still wearing the dark suit from whatever meeting had taken him away that morning. Marco handed him the envelope. Lorenzo examined the photographs without speaking. Then he reached Bianca's picture and stopped, only for a second. Amelia saw it, a tightening at the jaw, a stillness in his shoulders. Old damage. There it was again. Lorenzo ordered the entire estate security system reviewed from midnight onward. No shouting, no threats. He didn't need either. Men moved the moment he spoke. Within seconds, only Amelia and Lorenzo remained. The photographs lay between them, and Amelia understood immediately. He wasn't primarily worried about the envelope. He was waiting for her reaction. Clear his throat. Waiting for the questions. Waiting for whatever always came next. So Amelia asked the one thing he clearly did not expect. Whoever sent it, how had they gotten inside? Lorenzo looked at her. Not what he had been waiting for. Amelia didn't mention Bianca. Didn't mention the women. Didn't mention the rumor. Not yet. She wanted the threat dealt with first because someone's failed engagement from years ago was less important than the fact that someone had just demonstrated they could enter the estate unnoticed. And strangely, that seemed to unsettle Lorenzo more than accusation would have. He had been prepared for judgment. Amelia had given him practicality. Again, the investigation took most of the morning. No guard had seen an intruder. No external camera showed someone entering. Nothing was missing. There had been no break-in. Eventually, Marco found the answer. The envelope hadn't come from outside. It had arrived inside a delivery of fresh flowers ordered for the breakfast room. Someone had paid a florist employee to slide it beneath the wrapping. Simple, cheap, effective. Nobody had penetrated the Deucer estate. But someone had understood Lorenzo's routines well enough to know exactly which delivery would reach Amelia. That was almost worse. Lorenzo wanted the flowers removed. All of them. Amelia objected. The flowers had done nothing wrong. Marco stared at her. Lorenzo stared at her. Amelia looked between them. She had apparently become the only person in Chicago willing to defend innocent hydrangeas from organized crime. The flowers stayed. Lorenzo's mood did not improve. Amelia waited until evening. Then she went looking for him. She found Lorenzo in his study, standing beside the same drawer where she'd discovered the rings. This time it was open. 6 velvet boxes sat exposed. He had one in his hand, Bianca's. Amelia knew without asking. There was something different about Lorenzo in that room. The Mafia boss disappeared slightly. What remained was simply a man staring at proof that he'd once been foolish enough to trust someone. Amelia stepped inside. Lorenzo heard her. His hand closed around the ring box. And there it was again, that instinctive retreat. He expected Amelia to mention the photographs, expected her to ask for details, expected the ugly curiosity he'd encountered before. Instead, Amelia quietly asked whether Bianca had been number 3. Lorenzo's eyes lifted. His silence answered. Amelia's stomach tightened. Something about Bianca had always felt too personal. Now she knew why. The story came slowly, mostly through narration rather than explanation. Because Lorenzo Duca was not a man who had ever learned how to discuss humiliation comfortably. Bianca Romano had been different from the first 2. At least Lorenzo had believed she was. She had stayed longer. He asked more questions, made him believe his reputation didn't matter, and eventually Lorenzo trusted her enough to reveal the one subject he avoided with everyone else, the private reason behind the whispers. The thing about his body, people had exaggerated until it became almost mythical. Some of the rumors were nonsense. Others had begun with truth. Lorenzo was unusually large, not merely tall, not merely broad. And years earlier, he had admitted to Bianca that the idea of intimacy frightened him far more than anyone realized. Not because he feared losing control, but because he feared hurting or overwhelming a woman he cared about, Bianca had reassured him. Then the engagement ended. Within weeks, details Lorenzo had told one person privately were being repeated at dinners, at parties, inside the private rooms of families that smiled respectfully whenever he entered. The details changed each time. They grew. They became jokes, warnings, stories. Women who had never been alone with Lorenzo began talking about him as though he were some impossible creature rather than a man. Bride number 4 already knew before Lorenzo even met her. So did 5. By 6, Lorenzo no longer knew whether a woman looking at him was seeing him or remembering something somebody had whispered. Eventually, he stopped trying. That was the part Amelia hadn't understood. The 6 rings weren't 6 great romances. They were 6 times Lorenzo had allowed hope into a room only to watch gossip enter behind it. And Lorenzo had become tired. So tired that by the time Amelia arrived, he had already prepared himself for her departure. Amelia listened without interrupting. She didn't laugh, didn't stare strangely, didn't ask for details. That seemed to affect Lorenzo most because he had been braced for a reaction, and Amelia gave him none of the ones he'd feared. Instead, she looked angry. Not at him. For him. Lorenzo noticed and immediately misunderstood. He started explaining that she still had time to leave. Of course he did. Amelia nearly lost patience. This man could manage armed men, corporations, and an entire criminal empire, but give him one emotionally complicated woman. And his first instinct was apparently to arrange transportation. She stopped him, not with shouting, with one question. Did he actually want her gone? Lorenzo went silent. Amelia waited. Nothing. There was her answer. She moved closer. For months, people had decided that Amelia's body made her difficult to love. Ethan had been particularly talented at it. He had never needed to call her ugly. That would have been too obvious. Instead, he had offered suggestions. Smaller portions, different dresses, better angles in photographs, a little more exercise, perhaps lose some weight before engagement pictures, perhaps wait before announcing anything publicly, perhaps become less. Amelia had spent almost 2 years being loved conditionally. Ethan wanted her as long as she remained a project, and the cruelest part was that he'd disguised every insult as concern. By the time Amelia finally left him, she had learned something important. People could make you ashamed without ever once raising their voice. Lorenzo stood completely still as she told him, because suddenly he understood. Amelia knew exactly what it felt like when someone looked at your body and decided it was evidence against your worth. Their wounds were different, but the language had been the same. Too much. Lorenzo had been told he was too much. Amelia had been told she was too much, too large, too noticeable, too difficult, too inconvenient. And somewhere along the way, both had started believing love required shrinking. Amelia looked at Lorenzo and realized how absurd that was. Maybe neither of them had ever been too much. Maybe they had simply spent too much time around people capable of giving too little. That landed. Lorenzo's expression changed. Not dramatically, but Amelia saw the years behind it. All the jokes he had ignored. All the humiliation he'd swallowed. All the times he'd stood quietly while people discussed something private. Because acknowledging it would only feed the gossip for once. Lorenzo had no armor ready. The distance between them became very small. Amelia stepped closer. Lorenzo didn't. She raised one hand and laid it against his chest. The exact same place she'd touched the day she arrived. Only this time she wasn't falling. There was no rug, no suitcase rolling away, no horrified women watching. Just Amelia and Lorenzo. His breathing changed beneath her palm. She lifted her other hand slowly toward his face. Lorenzo remained motionless. He wanted her. That much was obvious now. But just as he had in the kitchen, he refused to take the final step. Amelia almost smiled, Of course, the most feared mafia boss in Chicago apparently required written permission before kissing his own future bride. So Amelia gave him permission, without paperwork. She closed the distance herself. Their first kiss was nothing like the rumors surrounding Lorenzo. Nothing overwhelming, nothing frightening. It was careful, slow, almost restrained enough to make Amelia want to laugh. Lorenzo kissed her as though one wrong movement might change her mind. Then Amelia's fingers tightened slightly in his shirt, and something inside him finally loosened. Not completely, but enough. When they separated, Lorenzo looked down at her, with an expression Amelia had never seen before. Hope, not confidence. Hope. And somehow that frightened her more than anything, because now she had something she could hurt. The next morning, Lorenzo woke earlier than usual. For the first time in weeks, he didn't dread breakfast. That should have warned him, because Amelia wasn't there. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Maybe she was sleeping. Then 9. Dizero came. No Amelia. The pastry beside her plate remained untouched. 10 minutes later, Marco entered, and the entire world changed. He held Amelia's phone. It had been found near the eastern service gate. Lorenzo stared at it. No expression, no movement, nothing. Marco knew that look. It was the one that usually appeared immediately before someone else's life became extremely complicated. Lorenzo went upstairs. Amelia's room was empty. Her suitcase remained. Her clothes remained. Her passport remained. It had been made. No sign of struggle. Then he saw the envelope on the pillow. One sentence: "Come alone if you want her back." For several seconds, Lorenzo didn't breathe. 6 women had left Lorenzo Duca, and every time he had stood there and let them go. But Amelia Carter hadn't left. Someone had just this time taken her, and whoever had done it had just made one catastrophic mistake. They believed Lorenzo's greatest weakness was his size. They were about to discover. It was Amelia. Amelia woke with a headache, a dry mouth, and absolutely no idea where she was. The last thing she remembered was walking through the eastern garden after breakfast. One of the staff had told her a delivery had arrived. Then nothing. Now sat inside an abandoned office overlooking what appeared to be an old warehouse. Her wrists were bound in front of her, not tightly enough to cut circulation, just enough to make escaping inconvenient. Amelia tested the chair solid. She looked toward the door, locked, wonderful. She had survived the Duca staircase for weeks, only to be defeated by someone using chloroform and a chair. Humiliating footsteps approached outside. Amelia stopped moving. The door opened, and suddenly the last person she expected walked inside. Ethan Cole. For 1 second, Amelia simply stared. Time had changed him slightly. Better suit, more expensive watch, same face, same carefully practiced charm, same eyes that always seemed to be measuring how useful someone might become. Seeing him didn't make Amelia miss him. It made something inside her go cold, because Ethan should not have known where she was. He should not have known anything about Lorenzo, and he certainly should not have possessed the kind of men capable of removing someone from the Duca estate, which meant her old life had just collided with her new one in a way she had never understood. The truth came gradually. Ethan's relationship with Amelia had never been entirely accidental. Her father, Daniel Carter, had spent years working as a financial consultant. Amelia had known his work involved wealthy clients. She had never known some of those clients were connected to men operating far outside the law. Before Daniel died, he had copied financial records, shell companies, offshore accounts, bribes. Money moving between businesses that should never have known each other existed. Evidence. And Ethan believed Amelia had inherited access to it. Years earlier. He'd tried obtaining it quietly. Dating Amelia made getting close easier. Marriage would have made it easier still. But Amelia had left before he succeeded. At the time, she had believed she was escaping a controlling fiancé. She had never imagined she was also destroying part of a financial scheme. Now Lorenzo Duca was involved. And that changed everything. If Lorenzo found those records, rival organizations could collapse. Political allies could be exposed. Millions could disappear. Men could go to prison. Some would prefer prison. Because the Ducas would discover who had been stealing from them. Amelia suddenly understood why Ethan had returned. Not love, not jealousy, fear. She possessed something without realizing it, and Ethan needed it before Lorenzo discovered what it was. The old Ethan appeared quickly. Not the criminal, the man. The one who knew exactly where Amelia's insecurities lived. He reminded her that Lorenzo had been rejected repeatedly, that women far more appropriate for his world had walked away, that Amelia should consider why a man like Lorenzo was suddenly willing to keep her. It was familiar. Poison delivered politely. Ethan had always been good at that. Once Amelia might have swallowed it. Now she nearly felt sorry for him because Ethan still believed she was the woman who had left him. She wasn't. Living with Lorenzo had changed something. Not her body, her perspective. Lorenzo had never hidden her, never corrected how she ate, never suggested changing what she wore, never moved her behind someone else in a photograph, never treated being seen beside her as generosity. Ethan had spent years attempting to make Amelia smaller so he could feel bigger. Lorenzo, a man physically larger than almost everyone around him, had never once required Amelia to shrink, and suddenly, Ethan's old tricks sounded pathetic. Amelia didn't need to tell him that. Her face did. He saw the difference. It made him angry. Good. Meanwhile, Lorenzo had already broken the only instruction he had been given. Come alone. He would. Technically, that was the important word. Marco had stared at the note for several seconds before looking at Lorenzo. Neither man needed to discuss whether Lorenzo was actually going anywhere unsupported. The Duca organization mobilized quietly. Cars moved, phones lit up, cameras were searched, traffic footage reviewed. The vehicle used near the Eastern Gate was found within an hour. From there, another, then another. By afternoon, Marco had an address. Old warehouse, industrial district, owned through 3 shell corporations. One of those corporations connected back to Ethan Cole. Lorenzo recognized the name. Amelia had mentioned him only once. That was enough. Something about Lorenzo's expression made Marco stop asking questions. The plan was simple. Lorenzo would arrive through the front entrance alone. Marco and everyone else would interpret the word alone creatively. Amelia heard the warehouse doors open below, then footsteps, slow, heavy, unhurried. Ethan looked toward the corridor. Amelia's heart started pounding. She knew those footsteps. Lorenzo. For the first time since waking, fear genuinely hit her. Not for herself, for him. Because she knew Lorenzo would come. That was the problem. Ethan knew it, too. Lorenzo entered without a jacket, no visible weapon, no guards, no Marco. Just Lorenzo Duca. And for the first time since Amelia had met him, he wasn't trying to make himself less intimidating. There was no careful lowering of his voice, no deliberate distance, no restraint designed to reassure a room full of strangers. He walked through the warehouse like he owned every shadow inside it. Men shifted instinctively when he passed. That was the thing people misunderstood about Lorenzo. They thought his size created his authority. It didn't. His authority made his size worse. A large man could be ignored. Lorenzo Duca could not. He found Amelia upstairs, saw the ropes around her wrists, saw Ethan, and went completely still. Amelia had seen Lorenzo angry before, or thought she had, she realized now. She had never seen anything close. The dangerous thing wasn't shouting. It was how calm he became, how everything unnecessary disappeared from his face. Even Ethan noticed. For the first time, the confidence around Amelia's former fiancé cracked. Ethan wanted the financial records. Lorenzo didn't have them. Neither did Amelia. That was the absurdity. Men had kidnapped her over something she didn't even know existed. But Lorenzo didn't care about the records. Not yet. He cared about one thing, getting Amelia out. Ethan had expected leverage. What he had failed to understand was that threatening someone Lorenzo loved did not make Lorenzo easier to control. It made him simpler. There were no competing priorities anymore. No negotiations, no reputation, no empire, just Amelia. That made him extremely dangerous. One of Ethan's men moved toward Lorenzo. Bad decision. The confrontation was fast. Not glamorous, not theatrical. A fist, a body hitting a wall. Another man reached for a weapon. A gunshot cracked somewhere downstairs. Then another. Ethan's head snapped toward the sound. Confusion spread across his face because men were shouting below. Not his men. Marco. The Ducas were already inside. Ethan had told Lorenzo to come alone. He had failed to specify that 20 heavily armed men couldn't arrive separately. Marco would later consider this flaw in Ethan's wording. At the moment, nobody was laughing. Ethan grabbed Amelia. That was his final mistake. He dragged her from the chair and pulled her against him. Lorenzo stopped. Amelia saw something in his face. Then not fear for himself, fear for her. And somehow that gave Amelia courage. Ethan had always underestimated her. Even when they were together, he thought Amelia avoided confrontation because she was weak. He had never understood that kindness and weakness were not the same thing. Amelia slammed her heel down on his foot hard. Ethan cursed. His grip loosened. Amelia twisted away. Unfortunately, her escape contained all the grace the universe had apparently allotted her. Her foot caught the chair. She stumbled. Lorenzo moved. One arm caught Amelia before she hit the floor. The other dealt with Ethan, and within seconds it was over. Ethan was down. Marco's men flooded the room. Amelia stood inside Lorenzo's arms, breathing hard, shaking, alive. Lorenzo looked her over immediately. Face, hands, wrists. No blood, no obvious injury. Then his gaze returned to her eyes, and Amelia saw something heartbreaking. He was waiting again, waiting for fear. Because she'd just seen the Lorenzo everyone whispered about. Not the man repairing jewelry, not the man buying pastries, not the man laughing in the kitchen. The other Lorenzo, the one enemies knew, the one capable of violence, when violence came through his door. Lorenzo released his grip slightly, as though giving her space to step away. Amelia saw it, and something inside her broke. She moved toward him instead. Fast. Too fast. Her shoe caught the chair leg again. Lorenzo caught her before she went down. For several seconds there was silence. Amelia looked at this chair, then at him. Then she started laughing. Not because anything was funny, because she was exhausted, terrified, relieved, and apparently incapable of having one dramatic reunion without furniture getting involved. Lorenzo stared at her. Then a laugh escaped him, too. Marco entered just in time to witness Chicago's most feared mafia boss holding his kidnapped bride. While both laughed at a chair, Marco decided he had seen enough for one day. He turned away. The financial records were eventually found. Daniel Carter had hidden access information among Amelia's inheritance documents. Lorenzo's people secured everything. Ethan's operation collapsed quickly after that, but none of it mattered to Lorenzo as much as getting Amelia home. He remained close throughout the drive, not touching her constantly. Just there, a warmth beside her, a wall between Amelia and the world. She fell asleep against his shoulder before they reached the estate, and Lorenzo didn't move for the rest of the journey. The next morning, Amelia expected tenderness, maybe breakfast, maybe non-crushing her in a hug. Maybe Lorenzo finally admitting he'd nearly lost his mind. Instead, she found a passport on the table. Beside it, a plane ticket and documents giving Amelia access to a private account containing enough money to begin again almost anywhere in the world. Amelia stared, then looked at Lorenzo. He stood across the room, calm, controlled, infuriating. The 90-day arrangement was over. She owed him nothing, no engagement, no marriage, no obligation, because he had rescued her. Lorenzo had decided she was free completely, and Amelia Carter realized after everything they had survived, Lorenzo Duca still believed the safest ending to their story was watching her walk away. Amelia did not cry. Not immediately. First, she became angry. Very angry. Because apparently the most powerful mafia boss in Chicago possessed the emotional intelligence of an expensive marble statue. For weeks, Amelia had stayed. She had listened, trusted him, kissed him, fallen asleep against him, been kidnapped because of circumstances tied to her own past. And still, somehow, Lorenzo had concluded that what she wanted most was a plane ticket. She looked at the documents, then at him. Lorenzo remained calm, because he genuinely believed he was doing the honorable thing. That made it worse. He didn't want Amelia marrying him out of gratitude. Didn't want the rescue confused with obligation. Didn't want safety mistaken for love. If Amelia stayed, he needed to know she was choosing him. Not the Duca name, not the money, not the protection. Him. It was perhaps the most loving thing Lorenzo had ever done. Amelia still wanted to hit him with the passport. She didn't, mostly because Nona Rosa entered at precisely the right moment. The old woman looked at the ticket, looked at Lorenzo, then looked at Amelia. One glance was apparently enough to understand everything. Rosa sighed, not gently, the sort of sigh usually reserved for relatives who had become a personal disappointment. Then she left. No advice, no interference. That frightened Lorenzo far more than yelling would have. Amelia almost smiled. Almost. Then she followed Lorenzo into the foyer, the place where this ridiculous story had started. Same staircase, same marble floor, same dangerous rug. Amelia eyed it suspiciously. The rug had history. Lorenzo stopped near the bottom of the stairs. Amelia stood opposite him and asked how many women had left before her. He didn't like the question. She waited anyway. 6. The number hung between them. 6 women, 6 rings, 6 reasons Lorenzo had spent years believing something about himself must be wrong. Amelia shook her head. He had been counting the wrong thing. 6 women leaving proved only one thing. 6 women left. Nothing more. It didn't prove Lorenzo was impossible to love. Didn't prove he was too much. didn't prove something about his body made him unsuitable for tenderness. It meant those women had made choices. And now Amelia was making hers. She stepped closer. Lorenzo watched. Hope was beginning to appear again. That dangerous thing he kept trying to kill before it could hurt him. Amelia told him there was one important difference between her and the women who came before. She was number 7. And Amelia Carter had never been particularly good at walking away, especially in heels. For a moment, Lorenzo simply stared. Then he laughed quietly at first, and Amelia watched the tension leave his shoulders. Not completely, but enough. Then Lorenzo did something unexpected. He reached into his pocket. Amelia's breath caught. A velvet box appeared. Not one of the 6. This one was new. Lorenzo lowered himself to one knee, in the same foyer where Amelia had nearly strangled him weeks earlier. At the top of the staircase, something moved. Amelia looked. Donna Rosa, Marco, both pretending badly not to watch. Amelia decided to ignore them. Lorenzo opened the box. The ring caught the light. Beautiful, elegant, chosen for her. Amelia's eyes immediately filled, and because the universe had a sense of humor. She stepped forward too quickly. Her shoe clipped Lorenzo's hand. The ring box flew. It hit the marble floor and skidded away. Everyone froze. Amelia stared in horror. The ring continued sliding straight toward the narrow gap beneath the cabinet. Marco moved his foot, stopped it. Silence. Amelia covered her face. Of course, naturally. Why would her proposal behave normally when absolutely nothing else in this relationship had? Marco bent down and retrieved the box. His expression remained professional. His eyes did not. Amelia pointed at him. He immediately straightened his face. Donna Rosa had no such discipline. The old woman began laughing. Lorenzo looked at Amelia, then the ring, then back at Amelia, and finally he laughed too. Amelia warned all of them with one look. This incident would never be mentioned at the wedding. Nona Roa was already mentally writing her speech. Once the laughter faded, Lorenzo tried again. No arrangement, no 90 days, no family obligation, no protection agreement, no debt, only a question. A real one. This time. Did Amelia Carter want to become Amelia Duca, knowing exactly who Lorenzo was? The gentleman, the dangerous man, the stubborn man, the man with a reputation larger than reality, the man who still occasionally believed rejection was waiting behind every good thing. Amelia looked down at him and understood the deeper question beneath the proposal. Was all of him acceptable? Amelia had spent half her life asking herself the same thing. Would someone choose all of her? Not after weight loss, not after changing, not privately, not reluctantly, exactly as she was. And Lorenzo had answered that question every day without realizing it. So Amelia answered his yes. No hesitation, no clear-as-throat dramatic pause, just yes. Lorenzo slid the ring onto her finger. This time it stayed there, and somewhere behind them, Marco quietly removed the dangerous rug from the foyer. Amelia noticed several hours later. Nobody admitted responsibility. News of the engagement spread quickly. Some people expected it to collapse. 1 week passed. Amelia remained. 1 month still there. 3 months. The wedding date was announced and the whispers began changing. For years, people had asked what was wrong with Lorenzo Duca. Now, people wanted to know what Amelia Carter had discovered that 6 women before her apparently hadn't. Amelia never answered. Neither did Lorenzo. Some truths didn't belong to spectators. At the Duca Foundation Gala, several months later, Amelia entered beside Lorenzo, wearing a deep emerald gown that hugged every curve. No hiding, no stepping behind anyone, no apologizing. 100 people filled the ballroom. Some recognized Lorenzo's former brides. Some remembered the jokes. Some had probably participated. Amelia felt the old instinct, the one telling her to make herself smaller. Then Lorenzo's hand found hers. He introduced her publicly. Not as a woman fortunate enough to marry into the Duca family. Not as someone he had rescued. Not as someone who had accepted him when others wouldn't. He introduced Amelia as the woman E had been fortunate enough to convince to marry him, and something inside Amelia finally healed, because Ethan had once made public love feel like a reward she needed to earn. Lorenzo wore his pride in her openly, without qualification, without embarrassment, without asking her to change a single inch. Across the room, Bianca Romano heard it. For a moment, her expression tightened. Amelia saw, then stopped caring. That surprised her most. Bianca had become irrelevant. The 6 women had become irrelevant. There were no ghosts left to compete with. Only Lorenzo, only Amelia, only the life they had chosen. Their wedding took place in early autumn. Non Rosa had promised something small. Nobody believed her. They were correct. The Duca estate became a small country for 3 days. Flowers everywhere, security everywhere, relatives appearing from Italy who Lorenzo swore he had never met. A cake large enough to qualify as architecture. Marco spent most of the morning preventing disasters before Amelia could personally create them. By late afternoon, everything was ready. Lorenzo stood at the end of the aisle. For once, the great Lorenzo Duca looked nervous. His hands remained still. His face remained controlled. But Marco knew him. Nona knew him. And when the doors opened, Amelia knew too. She appeared at the far end, beautiful, full-figured, radiant, walking toward him. And suddenly, Lorenzo remembered every woman who had walked away. Not individually, not their faces, just the feeling. Doors closing, rings returning, hope becoming embarrassment. For years, Lorenzo had thought those departures proved something about him. Then Amelia took another step toward him, and another, and another. The entire world seemed to disappear. Only one woman left. Bride number 7. The Clears Throat woman, who had arrived knowing enough to be curious, stayed long enough to discover the truth, and loved him enough to make all the old whispers meaningless. Then Amelia's shoe caught lightly beneath the hem of her dress. The room gasped. Lorenzo moved instantly. Amelia recovered before falling. She looked up, saw him already halfway down the aisle, and laughed. The entire room followed. Lorenzo shook his head, but he was smiling. Instead of returning to the altar, he held out his hand. Amelia took it, and they walked the remaining distance together. It was appropriate. Amelia Carter had never been particularly good at walking toward Lorenzo Duca without nearly falling, and Lorenzo had become very good at catching her. Months later, the Duca estate no longer looked untouched. Amelia's shoes appeared beneath chairs. Books remained open. Coffee cups were occasionally forgotten. Fresh flowers sat everywhere. Several decorative tables mysteriously disappeared after repeated collisions. Lorenzo claimed the changes improved traffic flow. Nobody believed him. Marco maintained a private count of objects Lorenzo caught before Amelia broke them. Amelia eventually discovered the list. She was offended, not because the list existed, because the number was 43. She had remembered perhaps 20. That seemed unfair. Non Rosa considered the entire marriage her personal achievement. Lorenzo refused to give her credit. She took it anyway. And slowly, Lorenzo stopped waiting for Amelia to leave. That was perhaps the biggest change. He no longer watched every disagreement as though it might become goodbye. No longer stiffened whenever someone mentioned his past. No longer treated his body as something requiring warning labels. Amelia changed too. She stopped disappearing toward the back of photographs, stopped laughing off genuine compliments, stopped treating public affection like something temporary. Neither of them became smaller. That was the point. Lorenzo remained enormous, powerful, dangerous when he needed to be. Amelia remained curvy, clumsy, warm, and apparently still in an active feud with expensive furniture. They simply stopped believing love required either one to become less. For years, Lorenzo Duca had believed 6 women walking away proved there was something about him no woman could accept. Amelia Carter had spent years wondering whether there was simply too much of her for a man to love without conditions. They had both been wrong. Because the right person doesn't measure love by how much of you they can tolerate. They simply look at all of you and stay. 6 women had walked away from Lorenzo Duca. The 7th walked straight toward him, nearly tripped on the way, and became the only bride he would ever need. If Lorenzo and Amelia's story kept you watching until the very end, show some love by hitting the like button and subscribing to Mafia Muse Affairs for more powerful mafia romance stories filled with danger, passion, and unexpected love. And before you go, drop your country or city in the comments. I'd love to see where everyone is watching from.